In this podcast episode, Ron Paul, the former congressman and longtime advocate for liberty and sound monetary policy, discusses the unfolding economic, social, and political crises facing the United States. The conversation touches on Ron Paul's foresight regarding monetary instability, endless wars, rising national debt, and the erosion of freedoms. His principled stance on non-interventionism, criticism of the Federal Reserve, and dedication to truth and liberty also receive significant attention, alongside reflections on his personal life and political career. Ron Paul is portrayed as an exceptionally decent and principled man, deeply committed to nonviolence, honesty, and moral clarity. Despite harsh criticism and unfounded accusations labeling him a racist or anti-Semite, Paul consistently maintained a respectful and inclusive approach toward all peoples and religions. His critics, often from neoconservative factions, targeted him not because of hatefulness or wrongdoing, but because his principled, non-interventionist views and criticism of U.S. foreign policy threatened entrenched powers. His personal life, marked by a loving, long-term marriage and family, as well as simple pleasures like bicycling and tending roses, reflects his gentle demeanor and genuine character. A central theme of Ron Paul's political philosophy is monetary policy, particularly his early warnings about the dangers of fiat currency and unchecked money printing by the Federal Reserve. Long before these views gained mainstream attention, Paul was advocating for a return to sound money principles based on gold. He describes the 1971 Nixon administration's decision to sever the dollar's peg to gold as a declaration of bankruptcy that initiated a prolonged period of monetary instability, inflation, and economic decline. Paul emphasizes that this shift, turning the dollar into currency backed by nothing but government promises, has eroded purchasing power, shrunk the size and value of everyday goods, and accelerated debt expansion that threatens the nation's economic future. Throughout his political career, Ron Paul faced a concerted effort to discredit him personally and ideologically. The podcast outlines how media outlets and political commentators, including figures like Ben Shapiro and publications like The New Republic, leveled baseless accusations against Paul, branding him as extremist or anti-Semitic to undermine his influence. These attacks often focused not on his ideas' merit, but on maligning his character to rally political opposition and suppress independent thought, particularly his opposition to U.S. military interventions and unconditional support for Israel. Paul's critics also feared the coherence and prophetic accuracy of his worldview, which threatened the narrative maintained by powerful interests invested in perpetual war and monetary manipulation. Ron Paul's foreign policy positions are grounded in a clear moral framework opposing violence and interventionism. He critiques the long-standing U.S. military involvement in the Middle East and other regions as wasteful, counterproductive, and morally indefensible. Paul predicted that wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, and Vietnam would fail to yield benefits for Americans and instead amplify division, suffering, and hatred. His insistence on evaluating U.S. engagements through the lens of constitutional duty and ethical consistency put him at odds with prevailing bipartisan militarism. He warns that loyalty to certain foreign allies, especially Israel, often drives U.S. actions independent of America's true interests and to the detriment of both countries. The podcast highlights Ron Paul's remarkable ability to foresee the trajectory of U.S. policy and economic trends decades in advance. In a 2002 speech, Paul accurately predicted the increasing federal debt, the expansion of the welfare state, the rise of militarized police powers domestically, and worsening international conflicts centered on the Middle East. He foresaw the devaluation of the dollar and the eventual resurgence of gold as an alternative currency. His warnings about the consequences of unchecked government spending and intervention in private life have repeatedly proven true, marking him as something of a political prophet whose cautionary counsel has been repeatedly ignored. Ron Paul frames his worldview as a simple, unwavering moral code: no lying, stealing, cheating, or murder, regardless of whether these acts are committed by individuals or governments. His libertarian philosophy is infused with Christian ethics, emphasizing nonviolence, individual responsibility, and limited government. Paul stresses that this moral clarity underpins his critiques of government overreach, economic policy, and war. His view rejects situational ethics and compromises, instead championing consistent application of universal principles to society and governance. Paul discusses the mounting challenges confronting the United States, including exploding national debt, headed toward $40 trillion or more, the fragile state of fiat currency, and the social and political fragmentation fueled by hostile partisanship and class divisions. He identifies a failing federal government supported by entrenched special interests, a compromised educational system, and widespread misinformation. Despite these difficulties, he expresses cautious optimism rooted in the increasing public awareness brought on by the internet and alternative media, as well as growing interest among younger generations in liberty and truth. Education emerges as a critical front in the ideological struggle Paul describes. He laments that the mainstream education system has strayed from the original constitutional intent and fostered dependence on government rather than responsible freedom. However, he also notes encouraging signs in the popularity of homeschooling and the ability of direct engagement to inspire young people. Paul shares anecdotal experiences from his campaigns, highlighting the enthusiasm and intellectual curiosity of youth who resonate with his messages about freedom, monetary policy, and peace. He underscores education as an essential tool for restoring America's constitutional and moral foundations. Throughout the episode, Ron Paul offers insights drawn from his long life as a physician, politician, father, and advocate. He recounts delivering thousands of babies as an obstetrician, an experience that reinforced his appreciation for the joy of new life and hope for the future. He emphasizes curiosity, seeking truth, and surrounding oneself with trustworthy information as keys to living well. Paul encourages embracing liberty not only as a political ideal, but as a practical, enjoyable way of life that involves continuous learning and positivity, even amid adversity. Ron Paul clarifies his stance on Israel, expressing support for the country itself, but strong criticism of its leadership's policies and the financial burden they place on the American taxpayer. He warns of the dangers posed by unconditional U.S. backing of Israel's military and diplomatic agendas, suggesting that this dynamic exacerbates conflict and endangers America's economic and geopolitical health. Paul's resolution would be a fundamental reevaluation of America's role abroad, pulling back from foreign entanglements to restore focus on liberty and prosperity at home. Despite acknowledging the significant threats posed by authoritarianism, economic decline, and global instability, Ron Paul remains an optimist. He believes the spread of information and ideas about liberty can counter the expansion of government control and militarism. The internet serves as a double-edged sword, but ultimately a powerful tool for awakening and organizing citizens. Paul stresses the importance of individual initiative, education, and adherence to moral principles as the foundations upon which a freer, better society can be rebuilt.